Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a real heavyweight, Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. In this explainer, we're going to unpack a pretty bold, controversial thesis. She argues that actually combating the global climate crisis doesn't just mean tweaking our habits, it requires a complete ground-up overhaul of our entire economic model. So let's break down exactly how she builds this case.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The climate wake-up call. 2. Capitalism versus the climate. 3. False promises and roadblocks. 4. The power of grassroots. And finally, 5. Rethinking our economic future.
Section 1. The climate wake-up call, the existential threat of our time.
So to really wrap our heads around Klein's arguments, we have to start with this baseline number, 97%. That is the overwhelming, undeniable consensus of climate scientists who agree that, yes, human activity poses a literal existential threat to life on Earth. But as Klein points out, climate denial is still everywhere. And she argues it's not actually because people just don't understand the science. It's because they are absolutely terrified of the radical economic changes it's going to take to actually fix it. And here is the terrifying consequence of that reluctance. 4 degrees Celsius, or 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit. The book lays out that without massive, sweeping intervention, global temperatures are on track to rise by at least that much by 2099. Klein issues a really stark warning here. This isn't just about, packing extra sunscreen for hotter summers. A spike of this magnitude threatens the actual survival of civilized life as we know it, thanks to extreme, totally unmanageable weather.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive gap we're dealing with. Just look at the math. We need to be dropping global carbon emissions by 8 to 10% every single year just to stay within safe limits. But in reality, our current annual emissions are actually increasing by almost 4%. Bridging this gigantic, incredibly daunting gap between what is absolutely required and what is actually happening, well, that's the central challenge of the entire book.
Section 2. Capitalism versus the climate, the ideological gridlock.
All right, this brings us to the absolute core of Klein's thesis. It's this idea that our status quo economic model, which is totally obsessed with perpetual, endless growth, is fundamentally incompatible with a healthy planet. As this quote perfectly captures, Klein doesn't look at climate change as just another environmental issue you can cross off a list by buying better light bulbs. She frames it as a fundamental failure of deregulated capitalism, and it demands a response from civilization as a whole. And according to the book, this ideological clash has created a massive geopolitical gridlock. It's basically made global climate conferences totally ineffective. On one side, you've got developed nations arguing that cutting emissions is completely pointless unless developing nations do the exact same thing. But then on the flip side, developing nations feel totally entitled to build the exact same kind of wealth the West already enjoys, arguing the historical burden should naturally fall on richer countries. It is a giant, frustrating global standoff.
Section 3. False promises and roadblocks, why current frameworks are failing.
Transitioning into what we might call the agitation portion of our review, the book points out the massive, systemic roadblocks standing in the way of progress. The biggest antagonist here? Big energy. The book details how this industry essentially rigs the system in its favor through aggressive political lobbying, gigantic government subsidies for fossil fuels, and international free trade agreements that literally, legally, undermine the growth of clean energy.
Now, what's really interesting is how Klein systematically dismantles our reliance on what she calls the false saviors. First, she warns us not to hold our breath waiting for some benevolent billionaire to swoop in and save the day. History shows us that's a losing bet. Second, she strongly cautions against banking on magical sci-fi tech fixes like geoengineering. Deploying massive prototype tools to scrub the atmosphere carries incredible, reckless risks, and honestly could trigger completely unforeseen environmental disasters of their own.
Section 4, the power of grassroots, the community-driven resolution. Okay, so if the top-down frameworks and the tech billionaires aren't going to save us, who on earth will? Well, Klein pivots to solutions here, arguing that mass social movements are basically our best and only hope. A really prime example from the book is the rise of energy co-ops. These are local, community-driven initiatives that generate renewable power and actually sell it back to the grid. In Germany, for instance, there are hundreds of these, totally proving that localized, sustainable energy is completely possible when regular communities just bypass private mega-utilities altogether. But this grassroots power isn't just about building alternative energy, right? It's also about actively fighting back against the current fossil fuel infrastructure. The book outlines a massive surge of resistance. Everyday farmers, activists, and lawyers occupying roads, fighting fracking in the courts, and pressuring massive universities to divest their funds.
Klein puts a huge emphasis on the power of indigenous land claims in North America, pointing out that they actually offer some of the absolute strongest legal leverage we have to physically stop fossil fuel extraction in its tracks.
Let's move to Section 5 and see how this builds up. Rethinking our economic future, a call for profound change.
Ultimately, Klein's conclusion demands a really profound trade-off. Yes, the book absolutely calls for a severe economic contraction. That means living more modestly, consuming way less, and finally stepping off that exhausting treadmill of endless shopping. But she frames this alongside some pretty incredible positive trade-offs. By giving up this obsession with mindless economic growth, she argues we get a world with tighter-knit communities, secure, sustainable local jobs, and, maybe best of all, way more time for our actual lives outside of work.
So we're going to close out this explainer today with a final provocative question straight from the core of Naomi Klein's thesis. Are we willing to embrace a contracted economy and live more modestly to secure a livable future? The author argues that saving our climate isn't about waiting for a miracle. It's about making the hard choice to act differently right now. It is a challenging thought to leave you with, but an absolutely essential one. Thank you so much for joining me for this review, and keep learning.